Hey everyone, MeltingMan234 here, and welcome to another episode of Forgotten Media, where I dig up some stuff you may or may not have heard of. When it comes to video games I played as a kid, I usually grew up on a lot of 3D platformers. There's of course my personal trio of childhood gaming icons, that being Crash Bandicoot, Spyro the Dragon, and Banjo-Kazooie, as well as other titles that I played like Pac-Man World or Toy Story 2. But there was one other game that I played a lot as a kid. I remember being at a friend's house, and then I saw they were playing a game involving some glove that was magically turning a ball into different things. Or maybe I saw the game at their place and I wanted to play it for myself. Or maybe I already had the game and saw that they also owned the game as well. Honestly, my memory's a bit hazy with this one. Anyway, if you haven't already guessed, the topic we're going to be looking at today is Glover, this weird platformer that was released back in 1998. Just like Dave the Barbarian and Media Play, Glover was one of those topics that's been on my personal bucket list for Forgotten Media since the beginning, but I just never got around to covering it, so I figured now would be a good time to talk about it. Long ago, a wizard and his magical gloves lived in the Crystal Kingdom. One day, while mixing up some potions in his cauldron, he accidentally turns himself into stone, and the gloves are separated from him. One flies out the window, while the other lands in the cauldron. The one outside, known as Glover, notices that the accident also causes the crystals to fall from the castle's spires. Without their power, the land is left in ruin and despair. Thinking quickly, he uses his magic to turn the crystals into rubber balls as they bounce away into other lands. Meanwhile, the other Glover emerges from the cauldron, now transformed into the evil Cross-Stitch. So now it's up to Glover to find the crystals, defeat Cross-Stitch, and restore the wizard and his kingdom. The game has quite the start, opening with the kingdom trapped in red clouds, bats flying over, all while Cross-Stitch's evil laugh is heard in the background. But as you progress through the game, it slowly returns to its more cheerful and peaceful environment. There are 6 worlds in total, each containing 3 levels, a boss battle, and a bonus level with varied themes. The goal of this game is to guide the rubber ball to the exit of the levels, defeat the boss, and bring it to the cavern where the stone wizard is. Once you do that, the next world will be unlocked to find the rest of the crystals. And if you think it's that simple, then you'd be wrong. The best way I can describe Glover's gameplay is, imagine those Marble Run toy sets that you find in stores, but as a platformer. You're going to deal with enemies, slopes, and other obstacles to make it to the end of the stage, as well as some puzzle solving and activating certain switches or getting the ball to certain areas. Since Glover is a magic glove, he can turn the ball into 4 different forms. There's a standard bouncy ball that can be dribbled to get some height, but can also be popped by enemies and other things, causing it to roll around for a while. There's the bowling ball, which is slower but more tougher. It can also sink underwater. And there's the ball bearing, that's mostly used for solving magnetic puzzles, but it's smaller and rolls faster, and also sinks underwater just like the bowling ball. And finally, there's the original crystal form that can be fragile, but it does add a ×2 multiplier when using it to collect those magic cards called Garabs. Sure, it's just used to rank up points, but sometimes you might get an extra life for ranking up a certain number. Either way, it's important that you don't let this thing get into danger. Pop too many times with the rubber ball, you lose a life. Watching it fall into the abyss, you lose a life. Breaking its original crystal form, you lose a life. Yeah, this game can be very challenging with how heavy the gameplay feels. Of course, you aren't always tethered to the ball throughout the whole game. Glover himself can defend on his own. There's the standard stomp attack, ducking, and jumping, as well as a cartwheel move that is only used once in the whole game and then forgotten about. There's also this crawl ability, but I never found any use for it. You also have power-ups in the game that are also cool, but only for situational purposes and levels, such as a speed ability, a wall climbing ability, a super strength ability, and many others that affect Glover or the ball itself. Sometimes you might find a frog spell ability that turns enemies into helpless frogs, which can be useful since you can't kill anyone, only stun them with a stomp attack. There's only a few select enemies you can kill, mostly the smaller enemies like these little guys that you'll occasionally run into. Glover himself is cute and a unique character. Back in the 90s, platformers usually relied on anthropomorphic animals as their main star, like Crash Bandicoot or Banjo-Kazooie. Glover was just this magical glove with some fun body language. When you see him lying down chilling, you can see that he also looks like a hand tapping of impatience, or when he's holding the ball like a regular hand would while standing upright when he's on top of the ball, or when he just feels like waving at you. Aww. While the stages are very challenging, the bosses themselves are pretty easy for the most part. Most of the time you'll need the ball to hit them or hit a switch to inflict damage. The Frankenstein monster boss is one of the tougher foes you'll encounter. So you basically need to guide this ball up onto this kill switch that only the ball can activate. But to do that, you gotta adjust the platforms so that they can lead up to the switch. But the platforms themselves are so small and far apart, and it's tough to actually get the ball up there. And what's even worse is that the Frankenstein's monster also has this electric ability, and if the ball touches it, then you instantly lose a life. Yeah, it's very frustrating. And finally, there's the bonus levels that are optional to play. First, you gotta collect all the Garubs and all of the levels of a world to unlock it. Unless you're playing on easy mode, where there are no bonus levels. They're pretty basic for the most part. The Carnival world has a shooting gallery level, while the spooky level has a maze level. Probably the most infamous and hard bonus level in Glover is the Atlantis one, where Cross-Stitch turns you into a frog and you have to make it to the end of the level, Frogger style. And it's the most clunky version of Frogger I've played. You only have 3 moves, one for a long jump, one for a short jump, and one to activate your tongue to collect Garubs or collect flies to get an extra life. And hopping from one moving platform to another is frustrating because sometimes you might overshoot or undershoot or not react quick enough when getting off the sinking platforms, or just slip off in general. Yeah, and every time you land in the water, you have to restart from the beginning. Ugh. The only advice I can offer is to make good use of those short hops and go diagonally when doing long jumps. Now, despite the fact that Glover can be weird at times, the music is surprisingly pretty good. Some of my favorite tracks are Atlantis 2 and Pirates 1. As for 100%ing the game, you have to collect all the Garubs and make it to the end of the levels, including the bonus levels. Doing so will display the cheat codes during the end credits. It might have been cool back then, but it doesn't really feel that special anymore since nowadays you can easily look them up on the internet. And there's quite a lot of cheat codes, which is surprising for this game. There's things like infinite lives, low gravity, or being able to summon the ball. And then there's also cheats where you can activate spells, like this death spell cheat, where Glover goes all Havana Kedavra on his enemies. And then there's a lot of weird ones, like turning the Garubs into these things. Or messing around with the camera, from a fisheye look to rotating it sideways. Heck, if you type that cheat code enough times, you can pretty much play the game upside down for a real challenge. Overall, Glover is a decent platformer. It can be rough around the edges, but it's fun to play once you get the hang of it. Now, despite the fact that I said that this was one of those games that I grew up on, you might be surprised to hear that Glover on the Nintendo 64 was not the version I grew up on. Yeah, it was actually the PlayStation version that I'm more familiar with. And as some Glover fans will tell you, that this is considered to be quote-unquote the bad version, despite the fact that it's still the same game. I'll just be listing off a majority of the noticeable changes that are in the PlayStation version. For one thing, the cutscenes are pre-rendered in that old CGI look. Might have been impressive back then, but nowadays they haven't really aged well. Still, might have some nostalgia for them. One weird detail about it is that it seems to imply that the other Glover was deliberately setting up the events of becoming evil, instead of the whole thing being an accident. And instead of a separate practice level, the hub world is the practice level. And I always liked that. It makes the place feel a lot more lively, instead of a lot of empty spots like in the N64 version. The only downside is that it sacrifices the original atmosphere of restoring a place of despair. Here, it's always bright and cheerful, and the music only changes once you're near the end of the game. I think the skybox changes on your level progression, but it's barely noticeable. Gameplay-wise, Glover and the ball in general feel more lighter than in the original, and made more powerful, such as the bigger shockwave for Glover's stomp move, to the ball being more invincible to enemies. But you still lose a life when rolling the ball into spikes or into lava. You can even throw the ball into the abyss and it'll just respawn back to you, but only a few times. I think after the 3rd or 4th time, then you lose a life. There's a lot more hints that explain the game, especially when the button controls are on screen. There seems to be this misconception with people in thinking that you can't turn off them when in actuality, you can. One way of doing this is just pausing the game and turn off the help option, and the other way of doing it is just simply hitting the select button. For the different forms of the crystal, the rubber ball feels extra bouncy. The crystal itself feels a lot more fragile to roll around for some reason. The ball bearing doesn't really have much changes as far as I know, but the bowling ball, oh boy, they really buffed this thing. Not only does it roll faster, but you can pretty much kill every enemy with it. The only exception are those flying green witches in the Fortress of Fear levels. Of course, you still have Garubs to collect, but now there's 100 of them in each level, and collecting them all in a world gives you an additional heart to your health bar, making things more easy. Now that I think about it, the PS1 version is very generous with extra lives when you know where to look. The levels are still the same, with minor changes here and there. The music in Prehistoric 1 is completely different for some reason. The platforms in the Frankenstein monster battle are now bigger, making things less stressful, and the annoying Frogger-like bonus level at Atlantis is now replaced with Glover running up to the top of a temple within the time limit. Of course, there are some things that aren't present in the PS1 version, such as the wall climbing potion and the first phase of the final boss, and sadly a majority of the cheat codes aren't present, just the more basic stuff like infinite lives and summoning the bomb. But one unique cheat code it does have is the cheat menu. Basically, it unlocks level select, credits, and listening to the game's music and sound effects. The only glitch I know of is this weird one in the cavern where you deliver the crystals. Over in this particular area, there's a good chance you can fall through the map. Or get stuck into this. Honestly, I find both the N64 and PS1 versions to be fine. Nothing too game-breaking or anything. It's more of a Sonic Unleashed kind of situation. You know, one version is very challenging and the other version is very easy. I suppose I should mention the game was also released on old PC computers for Windows 95 and 98. I haven't played that version, but from what I've heard, it's just a straight up port of the N64 version with music that would be featured in the PlayStation version. In more recent years, the game has been ported to Steam and other PC platforms. Yeah, never thought this game would get ported onto newer stuff. Now, originally I was going to try and finish this episode before the release of the Steam version, but too many things kept getting in the way with my personal life, as well as starting a new series. So I went and bought the game and tried it out, so I might as well give my quick thoughts on this. One interesting thing about the Steam version is that it features both the N64 and the PlayStation version. Yeah, I didn't think they would feature both of them. I thought they were just going to stick to the N64 version. I was playing this with an Xbox controller, as I've been getting more used to playing Steam games with a controller, and they both play really well. The N64 side is now in widescreen, graphics are slightly updated, and the draw distance is greatly reduced, so now you can see a lot more of the level. The only downside is that some of the sound effects are a bit glitchy. Sometimes they play fine, sometimes they're sped up, or play in the wrong places, or just don't play. Yeah, it kinda has a similar issue to the Xbox 360 port of Banjo-Tooie. And there's no proper way to quit the game to return to your computer, so you pretty much gotta Alt-Tab out of there and then close the program. But it still plays well, spells still work, the challenge is still there, the music is still good, and yes, the cheat code still works, so you can still have a lot of fun messing around with that. As for the PlayStation side, there's not a whole lot to talk about. Instead of a widescreen, we get this fancy border, and that's about it. It's just a straight up port, no updates or anything. My first impressions weren't positive at first because the control mapping was so wonky, and the in-game save load feature was broken, but I later found out there's an additional menu in this version by just hitting the escape key. Here you can adjust the size of the screen, remap the controls, and you now have 3 slots to save and load your progress. Overall, the Steam version of Glover is a decent port. My expectations were pretty low, so I really didn't expect much out of this, but having both the N64 and PS1 versions in this port was a nice surprise. And that covers the game Glover. The only thing left to talk about is the sequel. That's right, there was going to be a Glover 2 that, despite getting a lot of work done, it was cancelled for reasons I'll get into later. From what we know about it, the story would have involved the wizard on vacation while his magic gloves are left behind to look after the castle. One Glover tells the other to bring ingredients to mix up in the cauldron, only to reveal that he was using the other Glover to bring the ingredients so he can become Cross-Stitch again. I think. Yeah, the two Glovers look exactly the same, so it's hard to tell if it's the same one who became evil again. I like to imagine that the Glover you played as in the first game was all like, you know what, I want to be the villain this time, and the one that you're playing as in the sequel is the former villain. So now you have to stop Cross-Stitch from doing evil things onto the world. One noticeable difference is that instead of relying on guiding the crystal to the end of the level, Glover 2 would have focused more on being more of an open-world 3D platformer, meeting and helping NPCs, interacting with items and objects, along with learning new spells. It definitely feels like they took a lot of inspiration from Banjo-Kazooie with this game, especially with the dialogue boxes for the characters. There's definitely more emphasis on Glover's standalone abilities, like turning into a boxing glove to attack enemies, or interacting with items like a hand. It looks like this really was going to be a step up from the previous game, but alas. Apparently the game's publisher Hasbro Interactive at the time ordered an overstock of N64 cartridges, leaving them losing $500,000 in the process, thus cancelling Glover 2 and other projects. A real shame. It looks like this would have been a fun game to play, but I guess it just wasn't meant to be. There does exist some prototype cartridges that later got dumped onto the internet, showing the game was playable and mostly completed, so at least there's that, I guess. In closing, Glover is a decent platformer with its rough challenge and a unique style. As I mentioned before, the game has recently been ported to Steam, but if you're more into getting a physical copy of the game, you'll probably have better luck in finding the N64 cartridge. Those usually go for cheap. The PlayStation version is a little hard to find, while the old PC version is rare. And thus, I have finally crossed off this topic from my personal bucket list for Forgotten Media. Now, if only I can get around to covering Peter No-Tail and the PlayStation EyeToy. But until then, this is Melting Man 234 signing out.